Hi all! In this module, we're learning about diversity in groups. On a fundamental level, diversity is a way to talk about the ways in which people differ from one another. There are lots of aspects of diversity. For instance, people can vary from each other in terms of their race, their gender identity, religion, nationality, age, cultural heritage, ability status, sexual orientation, and many other characteristics. These are the dimensions that are aspects of our identity, and they shape a great deal of how we live our lives, how we communicate with others, how we participate in groups. Typically, when academics and organizational leaders, people in organizations talk about diversity, these are the types of characteristics that they mean, those that are directly tied with our identity. So diversity matters a lot in groups, and I encourage you to think about how diverse are the groups and teams you work with. In your organization, historically, what kinds of people are most represented? Who has the power and status in the group? How does the group treat people who differ from the majority in terms of race, gender, or some other identity category? Are those meaningful differences in your group? And how do you know? What does that look like? These are the core questions that we wrestle with in the module as we consider diversity in groups. Of course, there are other more kind of locally situated differences that can also matter in your group, and it might be useful to consider those aspects of diversity too. For example, people in your group can vary in terms of level of their experience with the task or their job status, right? Maybe there's diversity in terms of people's personalities or their kind of modes of communication that they're more used to, their familiarity with technology, right? Their role in the organization, the type of job, and so on. So this type of variation between individuals may or may not be important in your group, but it is also a way in which to think about diversity. So it's useful to be sensitive to these kinds of differences as well. So what do we know about diversity in groups? Well, first, we know that in many ways, diversity in groups is fantastic. Inclusion and representation of all kinds of people is ethical, and it's just a realistic thing for our globalized society. So in like a moral way, diversity is really important, and inclusion is a really central core value for many groups and organizations. There are also tangible benefits. In business settings, there's a lot of evidence that diverse teams are better at solving complex problems, they're more innovative, they can make organizations more successful, and academic research shows that heterogeneous groups, so groups that have lots of different types of members, make better decisions, are less likely to fall into this sort of false consensus of groupthink, they're more creative, and in general just do a whole lot of group things better than homogeneous groups or groups where everyone's the same. That sounds lovely, right? But here's the catch, that diverse groups can only achieve this kind of success if they actively work to mitigate the obstacles that make it harder for them to work together. Because just having different kinds of people present in the room or just having different kinds of people in the group, that's not enough, right? It's imperative that groups take a good, hard look at their norms, at the roles that group members play, the power dynamics in the group, and their task and relational communication to see how they engage in communication across these lines of difference. Just having people there is not sufficient, right? What do we do to actually be inclusive and welcoming and encouraging and welcoming and rewarding of all of the various aspects of our diversity? That's the question, right? So members of diverse groups face a lot of challenges. One of them, diversity shows up in people having different communication styles and expectations about what kind of communication is appropriate and effective. These styles and expectations are directly linked to our cultural background, and they show up in the way that we talk and listen and engage with others. For example, groups, especially in like a work setting, might develop a norm where people are expected to be honest, open, forthright, and assertive when providing information, analyzing options, and making decisions. Okay, that's great. But it's also a very specific culturally bound norm, one that values individualism and assertiveness. Lots of cultures place a higher value on collaboration, harmony, and politeness. So people coming from that background might have a way of speaking that's more indirect. Someone with this more indirect way of speaking might feel threatened and overwhelmed by the way the group typically goes about its tasks. They might stay quiet, not to rock the boat, and then group members might see them as social loafers, like, that person doesn't really contribute very much. They never speak up, right? They could be ignored. Or they might even be seen as passive-aggressive if they're trying to participate by asking questions or posing statements in an indirect way instead of following the right way to do things in the group. So thinking about like what are the norms and who's like not benefiting from those norms, that's a really important question. Groups also have very tangible power dynamics that are clearly relevant to diversity. So when you look at your own groups, ask yourself about what power dynamics are evident. Who gets listened to? Who gets discounted and overlooked? Who does the group see as a leader? What happens if someone says or does something that seems out of place or different? Does the group respond with curiosity and compassion, or with judgment and frustration? These are important questions to pay attention to over time. Even when we think we're being inclusive, we often don't notice our own biases and prejudices. That makes it really tricky to be inclusive because we often need feedback from other people to see where our personal blind spots are, right? And then finally, groups sometimes develop fault lines that divide them into subgroups. So we know that people generally tend to feel comfortable and more familiar with folks who we see as similar to us, right? Sometimes, though, we prioritize that comfort and we use that specific aspect of diversity to separate ourselves from people who we see as different. So group scholars call those fault lines. The fault line is the characteristic that divides group members into smaller subgroups. We don't set these up on purpose a lot of times, but they happen when there's some important characteristic that creates consistent and meaningful divisions. So sometimes the fault line in groups is around gender, right? People sit with and talk to others who have similar gender identity to theirs. Other times it can be around other things like job similarities or maybe similar hobbies of people who like sports, people who don't like sports, right? Or where people live or whether they have kids or do they go to church together, that sort of stuff. So just noticing that people have similarities and sit with other people who are like them seems innocent enough, and it may be. But you should watch and see whether those subgroups become rigid, and if they become an important way to understand what's happening in the group. For instance, I worked in one place where it became really clear that there was kind of an invisible difference based on religion, and that contentious decisions, that was always the thing that separated the people on the different sides. No one ever said that out loud or even really meant for religion to be used as a division in our group, but consistently it was clear to me that that was the meaningful characteristic that influenced discussion and decision making about relationships and the relationships in our group. So, when you do the reading and reflections this week, I encourage you to think about what aspects of diversity are evident in the groups that you participate in. Where are the fault lines? What are the group norms around disagreement, participation, and power that make a difference in your group? And what can you do as a member of a group to make those groups more inclusive and welcoming? Okay, that's it for now. As always, I look forward to reading your reflections, and I encourage you to email me or stop by virtual office hours for any questions or conversations you might have around this topic.